Hey cousin, welcome to CoCo Conjure. Here we talk about all things hoodoo, folklore, and spiritual journeys. My goal is to give foundation to the novice and inspiration to the advanced practitioner. If you haven't guessed already, my name is CoCo. If you are here, it's because you were meant to find me. That's not some woo-woo stuff. I don't advertise. I don't worry about what's going on with trends online and hoodoo or in just the occult in general. I just kind of do my own thing and hope the right people hear it. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for subscribing. And thanks for giving a like if you're moved to do so. I really appreciate it, cousin. It's that time of the month. It's a folklore episode, y'all. If you've been here before, you know that folklore episodes are normally themed. I've done devil tales, I've done church stories, I've done John stories, that kind of thing, you know. For this month, we are going to talk about conjure stories. Before I dive in, I want to talk a little bit about Zora Neale Hurston. Most people know her from Their Eyes Are Watching God or her various short fiction stories. If you've spent any time with me on this podcast, then you know I am, cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs for Zora Neale Hurston's work. In her work, she captures the very language and accent spoken by her characters. Just by the way she writes it down, she writes all her words almost phonetically when characters speak. Now, what some people don't know is that Hurston was also an anthropologist and a folklorist. She went out to Alabama, to Florida, to New Orleans. She went to Haiti, and she worked alongside hoodoo doctors and workers. She listened to these animal stories and these John stories. She traveled to Haiti and went on the pig hunt and was eventually initiated into voodoo. She was initiated into voodoo as well. Like, she's not just writing fiction, she's not just writing stories that eventually end up on television with Halle Berry and Michael Ealy, right? She's capturing the real life culture and unseen spiritual world of Black people in America and the Caribbean with her pen. I recently revisited one of the initiations of Zora Neale Hurston. This one particular was in New Orleans under the hoodoo doctor Luke Turner. You can read all about it in Hurston's book Mule and Men, or you can go back probably to the previous episode where I talk about it. But when I was trying to find the excerpt about this particular initiation, I went for Hurston's text, Hoodoo in America, found in the Journal of American Folklore, Volume 4, instead of Mules and Men first. And cousin, next thing I knew, I was deep in the conjure stories toward the end of the text. So for this episode, I'm reading exclusively from Hoodoo in America, specifically stories 16, 17, and 18. The first story I titled, because if you know anything about Hurston, most of the time she does not title the folklore or the conjure stories that she collects. So the first story I titled The War of Hoodoo. This is story 16 in Zora Neale Hurston's Hoodoo in America, found in the American Folklore Journal. Mrs. Grant lived down below Canal Street and was a faithful disciple of Dr. Saul, a popular hoodoo doctor who lived in Ucart Street near St. Claude. One hot summer night, Mr. Grant couldn't sleep, so he sat on the upper balcony in his underwear chewing tobacco. Mrs. Grant was in bed. A tall Black woman lived 2 blocks down the street. Now she and Mrs. Grant had some words a few days past, and the Black woman had been to a hoodoo doctor and bought a powder to throw at Mrs. Grant's door. She had waited till the still hour of 2 a.m. to do it too. Now, just as she was dusting the door, Mr. Grant on the balcony spit some of the tobacco juice and it struck the woman. She had no business at the Grant house at all, let alone at 2 o'clock in the morning throwing war powder against the door. But even so, she stepped back and gave Mr. Grant a piece of her mind that was highly seasoned. It was a splendid bit of Creole invective art. Now, he was very apologetic, but Mrs. Grant came to the door to see what the trouble was. Her enemy had retreated, but as soon as she opened the door, she saw the white powder against the door and on the steps. Moreover, there was an eggshell on each step. Mrs. Grant shrieked in terror and slammed the door shut. She grabbed the chamber pot and ran out of the back door. Next door were 3 boys. She climbed into their backyard and woke up the family. She must have some of the urine from the boys. This she carried through the neighbor's front gate and to her own door and dashed it over the door and the steps. One of the boys was even paid to take the shells away. She could not enter her front door until the conjure was removed. Now, the neighborhood was aroused. She must have a can of lye. She must have some river water in which to dissolve the lye. All of this was dashed against the door and the steps. Early next morning, she was at the door of Dr. Saul. Now, he congratulated Mrs. Grant on her steps that she had already taken, but told her that to be sure she had counteracted all the bad work, she must draw the enemy's wine. That is, she must injure her enemy enough to draw blood. So, Mrs. Grant hurried home and half-filled 3-quart bottles of water. She put these in a basket and the basket on her arm and set out for the restaurant where the night sprinkler of powders, the tall black woman, was a cook. She asked to speak to her, and as soon as she appeared, bam, 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 went the bottles over the black woman's head, and the wine flowed. But the tall black woman, she fought back, and in the fracas, she bit Mrs. Grant's thumb severely, drawing Mrs. Grant's wine. Now, this complicated affairs again. Something must be done to neutralize this loss of blood. So, Mrs. Grant hurried home and called on one of the boys next door and she said, "Son, here's $5. Go get me a black chicken, not a white feather on him, and keep the change for your trouble." The chicken was brought. She seized her husband's razor and split the live bird down the breast and thrust her fist inside the bird. As the hot blood and entrails enveloped her hand, she went into a sort of frenzy, shouting, "I got her! I got her! I got her now!" What I like most about this story is the frenzy and the tit for tat. The tall black woman threw powder. Mrs. Grant flits about panicked, drawing on her own knowledge of the occult, of hoodoo technique, on how to cut through the tall black woman's work, basically. And then Mrs. Grant, under Dr. Saul's instructions, she goes for blood. Child, can you imagine being in New Orleans and watching this world star level fight, like world star level occult fight break out? Or even being Mr. Grant and watch your wife freak out and toss little boy pee at your front door. Like, a war between hoodoos gets nasty. Like, not just like in ferocity, because hunting somebody down at their job so you can knock some bottles over their head, that's crazy. But like, it also gets downright bodily fluid nasty. So what's my takeaway? Well, first, chamber lie from young boys breaks curses, apparently. Second, as much as people would like to say that war water or war powder is not a hoodoo method, clearly that's not correct. And third, I don't care how bad something gets, I'm not putting my cut hand in a bloody raw chicken. Like, that's gross. The next story I titled Justice Finds a Way. This is story number 17 from Hoodoo in America in the American Folklore Journal, collected by Zora Neale Hurston. A wealthy planter in Middle Georgia was very arrogant in his demeanor towards his Negro servants. He boasted of being unreconstructed and that he didn't allow no niggas to sass him. A Negro family lived on his place and worked for him. The father, it seems, was the yard man and the mother the cook. The boys worked in the fields and their only daughter worked in the house and waited on the table. There was a huge rib roast of beef one night for dinner, and the white man spoke very sharply for some reason to the girl, and she sassed him back. He jumped to his feet and seized the half-eaten roast by the neck ribs and struck her with the vertebrae end. The blow landed squarely on her temple, and she dropped dead. The cook, her mother, was attracted to the dining room, and the white man had resumed his seat and was replenishing his plate. He coolly told the mother of the dead girl to call Dave and you all take that sew up off the floor. Dave came and the parents bore away the body of their daughter, the mother weeping. Now, Dave was known to dabble in hoodoo. The Negroes around both depended upon him and feared him. He came back to clear away the blood of the murdered girl. He came with a pail and a scrub brush. But first, he sopped his handkerchief in the blood and put that into his pocket. Then he washed the floor. That night, the Negro family, they moved away. They knew not to expect any justice. They knew better than to make too much of what had happened. But less than 2 weeks later, the planter looked out one night and he thought he saw Dave running across the lawn of the house. He came up to the window and he called to demand what he was doing on his place, but the figure disappeared in the tree. The man went into his wife's room to tell her about it and found her laughing hysterically. She laughed for 3 days, despite all the doctor did to quiet her. On the 4th day, she became maniacal and attacked her husband, the white planter. Shortly, it was realized that she was hopelessly insane and she had to be put in an institution. She made no attempt to hurt anyone else except her husband. She was gentleness itself with her 2 children. The plantation became intolerable to the planter, so he decided to move to more cheerful surroundings with his children. He had some friends in South Carolina, so he withdrew his large account at the bank and transferred it to South Carolina and set up a good home with the help of a housekeeper. 2 years passed and he became more cheerful. Then, one night, he heard steps outside his window and looked out. He saw a man, a Negro. He was sure it was old Dave. The man ran away as before. The planter, he called and ran from the house in pursuit. He was determined to kill Dave if he caught him, for he began to fear an ambush from the family of the girl that he had murdered. He ran back to get his son, his gun, and the dogs to trail the Negro, and as he burst into the front door, he was knocked down by a blow on the head, but he was not unconscious. His 20-year-old son was raving and screaming above him with a poker in his hand. He struck blow after blow at his father, and the father, the planter, kept dodging and covering himself as best as he could. The housekeeper rushed up and caught the poker from behind and saved the man on the floor. The boy was led away weeping by the woman, but renewed his attack upon his father later that night. This kept up for more than a month before the devoted parent would consent to his confinement in an institution for the criminally insane. This was a crushing blow to the profound and wealthy ex-planter. He once more gathered up his goods and moved away. A year later, the visitations returned. He saw Dave. He was sure of it. This time, he locked himself in his room and asked the housekeeper through the door about his daughter. She was reported missing, the girl. He decided at once that his black enemies had carried off his daughter Abby. He made ready to pursue. He unlocked his door and stepped into the hall to put on his overcoat. When he opened the closet door, his daughter pointed a gun in his face and pulled the trigger. The gun snapped, but it happened to be unloaded. She had hidden in the closet to shoot him whenever he finally emerged from his room. Her disordered brain had overlooked the cartridges. So, the planter, he moved to Baltimore, out in some fashionable neighborhood. The nurse who came to look after his deranged daughter had become his mistress. And he skulked about, fearful of every Negro man he saw. At no time must any Negro man come upon his premises. He kept guns loaded and handy, but hidden from his giggling, simpering daughter, Abby, who now and then attacked him with her fists. His love for his children was tremendous. He even contrived to have his son released to his charge, but 2 weeks later, as he drove the family out, the young man sitting in the rear seat attacked him from behind and would have killed him but for his paramour and a traffic officer. That's a powerful story. Dave drove them people crazy just so that way he could get to that plantation man. And then on top of that, like, even if he didn't get to the plantation owner, just this plantation owner having to watch his family try to kill him, for him to be nervous to go outside and see any black man, like, Dave fucked that man up. That was a two-pronged attack, if you ask me. I think a lot of times when people think justice work, they think Dr. Buzzard in the courtroom chewing root. But it doesn't have to look that way. As a matter of fact, I would say that because for most of this country's history, a good portion of this country's history, black people were not brought in front of a judge, or if they were, it was a kangaroo court, right? It didn't look that way. It didn't always look like chewing root. I think that because of the commercialization, because of the sensation of Dr. Buzzard, we think it looks that way all the time. Hoodoo, Black American folk magic, is a low magic system. Low magic. What does that mean? It means that we turn to spiritual work. We turn to hoodoo to solve our earthly problems. Yes, we can engage in it to heal our spiritual selves as well, or to have a closer relationship with some divine being if you want. But more often than not, we turn to hoodoo out of desperation. The landlord is going to kick you out. Your spouse is stepping out on you, and your survival depends on them being committed to you, right? Or in this case, getting justice for the death of a black girl at the hands of someone whose privilege would never allow them to see the inside of a jail cell. No one cared about this black girl, and the family knew that. Dave knew that. That's why he soaked his handkerchief in her blood before he cleaned it up. I think we saw this type of justice work in action during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. Anytime we would march, people would build altars to those, shrines to those who were tortured and or murdered by cops that will only get a slap on the wrist and maybe some administrative leave, right? For every rally, there was probably a hoodoo worker in the crowd. There were reports of people passing out Hajjan, invoking the power of the ancestors. So Black Lives Matter wasn't just a political system, a political movement for justice. It was also a spiritual movement for justice. Yeah. I digress. What's my takeaway? My takeaway is justice work is very much a cornerstone in hoodoo, because for most of this country's history, we could not count on justice being dealt any other way. We had to take it to the spirit world. We had to take it to the hoodoo doctor to get the closure, the justice that we needed. Okay, the final story I titled Hearts and Shakes. This is story number 18 from Hoodoo in America by Zora Neale Hurston, found in the American Folklore Journal. All right, here we go. When I was a boy, about 10 years old, there was a man named Levi Conway whom I knew well. He operated a ferry and had money and was highly respected by all. He was very careful about what he wore. He was tall and brown and wore a pompadour. He usually had a broad-brimmed Stetson. He began to change, though. People thought he was going crazy. He owned lots of residential property, but he quickly lost everything in some way that nobody seemed to really understand. He grew careless in his dress and became positively untidy. He even got to the point where he'd buy 10 cents worth of whiskey and drink it right out the bottle. He began to pick up junk, old boilers, stones, wheels, pieces of harnesses, all of that, and drag it around for miles every day. Then he'd bring it home and pile it up in his backyard. This kept for 10 years or more. Finally, he got sick in bed and couldn't get up. Tanti Lita kept house for him. She was worried over his sickness, so she decided to get a woman from the Treme to find out, what was wrong. The woman came. She was about 50 with a sore on her nose. She looked at Levi in the bed, and then she came out to Tanti Lita and said, "Sure, something has been done. I don't believe I can do anything to save him now, though. But I can tell you who did the work. You fix a place for me to stay here tonight, and in the morning, I'll tell you." Early the next morning, the woman, she sent for a heart of sheep or beef. She had them get her a package of needles and a new kettle. She lit a wood fire in the yard and filled the kettle 1/3 full of water and stood over the pot with the heart. She stuck the needles in one by one, muttering and murmuring as she stuck them in. When the water was boiling hard, she dropped the heart in. It was about 11 o'clock in the morning at this time, and she said, "Now we shall know who has done this thing to Levi. In a few minutes, the one who did it will come and ask for 2 things. Do not let him have either thing." And sure enough, in a few minutes, in came Pierre Voltaire, a man whom all of us knew. He asked how Levi was, and they told him, bad, pretty bad. And he asked if they would let him have 2 eggs, and of course they said no. Then he asked if they would lend him the wheelbarrow, and they said it wasn't here, so they couldn't lend it to him. The old woman winked and said, "That's him. That's him right there." And then Pierre Voltaire, he went on off. Then she told them to look into the pot, and when they did, the heart was gone. A week after that, Levi died. This is the funny part. Sometime after that, my older brother, my cousin, and we rode over to the west bank of the river, just knocking about as boys will. We found an old leaky boat turned upside down on the bank, just out of reach of the water. I wondered who owned this absolute piece of trash. My brother told me it belonged to Pierre Voltaire. I said, "Why doesn't he just get a decent boat? This is too rotten to float." I turned it over and found a great deal of junk under it. Bundles tied up in rags, old bottles and cans and the like. So I started throwing the stuff into the water, and my cousin, he helped me. We pushed the boat in too. Now my brother, he tried to stop us. I forget now how it was that he knew what we did, but 2 days later, I began to shake as if I had an ague. Nothing the doctors could do stopped me. And 2 days after that, my cousin began to shake. And 2 days after that, my brother started shaking. It was 3 or 4 months before we could all be stopped. But my brother stopped first, then my cousin, then I stopped last. Well then, so if you want to know if someone did some work over you, go get yourself a sheep or a beef tongue, a brand new pot, and some needles. I wonder how many of y'all are actually going to try that. I don't know if that would work for me. I don't know if I guess I would have to be really desperate to try and make that work. But yeah. I don't even know what to say for this one. Voltaire seemed like he was a nasty somebody. We don't even get the satisfaction of a reveal, like, why did he do this stuff to Levi, Probably out of jealousy, if the description of Levi says anything. Like, I feel like that's what's being insinuated. Levi had the world in his hand, and Voltaire said, not on my watch. But what my takeaway is really, and it's something that I've seen a lot on the internet. If you see some witchy shit or you see some hoodoo stuff and it's just not aimed at you, don't touch it. I don't know why so many people online are like, oh, I found this doll covered in dry blood with a miniature model axe sticking out of its head. Let me take a picture and take it home with me. Like, cousin, put it back. Just don't touch it and put it back. All right. We have reached the portion of the podcast where I flit about online. Facebook, Reddit, Instagram, all the places. And I pull out some questions to answer. Both of these questions come from Reddit. The first one says, what advice do you have for someone who wants to write a fiction book with occult themes? What advice would I have? First of all, I think that's so cool. As we speak, I have an armchair with a nice lantern lamp, hanging lantern lamp kind of situation. And it's got a remote, so I can even hit the button to put for book lights, And I got a stack of fiction books about witches and occult themes and all sorts of stuff. I love it. I love a good urban fantasy for sure. So my suggestion, if you would like to write a book with occult themes, is to be like Zora Neale Hurston. Get yourself in the mix with the people who are doing this stuff, right? Whatever that stuff is. For us on this podcast, it's hoodoo. But whatever that stuff is, I would get in the mix. I would get a feel for what that community is like, what the rules are, because as much as there are many ways to do magic, and as I said before, no hoodoo worker, no hoodoo doctor, no spiritual worker works the exact same way as someone else, But there are some pretty hard rules that we all follow, right? We all think that High John behaves this way. We all understand that you have to leave offering for spirit, water, whiskey, whatever. There's certain things that are just hardwired into the culture, into the magic system. So my first advice would be to get amongst the people, to find the community that you're interested in writing about, and be like Zora, write everything down without discrimination. My second would be, if you can't get into the mix, my second piece of advice would be to read the folklore. Read the folklore and read books written by the people in the practice. Because we didn't dissect each piece of spiritual work in this episode, but honestly, every last story, all 3 of those stories could have been in a single episode by itself. about justice work, about revenge, about, you know, jealousy, and about driving people crazy. Like all of those things could have been its own, you know, episode, and we could have dived into the mechanics of how the work was working, you know. And I find that that's true not just for Black American folklore, but also for folklore across cultures, you know. So, yeah, get into the community. And if you can't find the community, then I would read the stories coming out of that community for sure. Okay, second question. If you ran a school for occultism, what subject would you teach? Like, what subjects would you teach? Oh, man. So, like, if there was Hoodoo Harry Potter, what subjects would I teach? I would definitely teach a one-on-one, I should say, an entry level course on uncrossing and clearing. I feel like you don't have to be this super plugged in, prestigious worker in order to uncross yourself, like from life's conditions or from clearing out your space. Like I don't, you know, and it's foundational things to know. If I had to teach an advanced course, like I had to teach two courses and I had to teach an advanced course, I would definitely teach finding your niche, finding your place in hoodoo. Historically, not every hoodoo worker, not every spiritual worker specialized in everything. They were few and far between, like your Buzzards, Marie Laveau's, etc. Like they may have specialized in everything, but that was not normal from what I understand. And we all have our own gifts and talents of what we're good at, etc. So I would definitely teach a course on that, on finding your niche. Another course that would be really cool to talk about, like if I was in this hoodoo Harry Potter school, it would be bridging the gap between our religion. Well, I should say bridging the gap between our ancestors' religion and our place in religion, right? So trying to sort that understanding that we can move through the hoodoo space, the spiritual space, and understand that our most immediate ancestors were Christian, and that if we go far enough back, they probably weren't, and that we can utilize all of those texts, holy texts, and life philosophies in the way that we live now and the way that we do spiritual work now without having to be religiously attached. Yeah. Like, I don't think that's necessary anymore. It's okay to be spiritual, but not religious. And I feel that a lot of times in hoodoo, you're either super Christian or you are all about the African pantheons of divine beings. And there's very few of us who fall in that third category of, well, you know, I don't deny existence of any of those things, of any of those divine beings, but also they're not the center point or center focus of my practice. So yeah, I would definitely teach that as well. Oh, and I guess another 101, it's so obvious, right? Because we're in a folklore episode. I would teach folklore. I would teach, you know, conjure and folklore, obviously. Okay. We've reached the end of the podcast. Thank you so much, cousin, for staying with me. I hope you had a good time. I enjoyed reading those stories for sure. Before we get out of here, cousin, I just want to let you know that you deserve the world. That our magic was written down. Not conventionally. We're not looking at like a wicked grimoire, but if you dive into the folklore, you will find that A lot of our magic, a lot of our culture was written down for the next generation to read. And I would tell you to be wary of anyone who tells you not to read a book. I don't trust it. There's this old saying that says, if you want to hide knowledge from a black person, put it in a book. And I would like to believe that that is a stereotype that no longer holds weight in our community. So dive into the folklore, pick apart, the stories, and use it to call for your blessings, and know that if you call for your blessings, cousin, they will come to you. I will see you guys next time.